called her name in the village square, and every breath stopped. Arlena, the widow who had lost everything, who scrubbed floors for bread crusts, who lived in the shadows of a kingdom that had forgotten her. But the castle never summoned peasants, not unless it was for judgment, not unless it was for death. When she walked through those iron gates, trembling and alone, she had no idea she was about to face the 12 most powerful knights in the realm, the same men who had destroyed her life years before. The king himself declared she would prove who spoke the truth. But the truth Arlena carried was more dangerous than any sword, more devastating than any army. It was a secret buried for 15 years, a lie so massive it held up the very throne itself. What she did in that marble hall would shake the foundations of the kingdom. Knights would fall not by blade, but by the weight of their own corruption. The king would kneel before her, broken by revelations that destroyed everything he believed. And when he offered her the crown, when he placed the fate of the entire realm in her scarred peasant hands, her answer would be something no one could have possibly predicted. This is the story of how one woman's grief became a revolution, how silence became a roar, how the weakest person in the kingdom brought the most powerful to their knees. But first, she had to survive what waited for her behind those castle walls, 12 men who knew that if she spoke her truth, their world would burn. The sun had barely broken through the gray-stone rooftops of Varnell when the king's messenger burst into the village square, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through flesh. Arlena of Varnell. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Every breath seemed to stop. Every hammer paused mid-strike. The blacksmith's apprentice dropped his tongs, the clatter echoing like a death knell. It was her name, the widow who had lost everything in the last war, the woman who scrubbed floors at the tavern for bread crusts, the ghost who wandered the edges of their world. And now the castle was calling for her. Arlena stood frozen at the baker's doorway, her hands white-knuckled around the wooden frame. Flour dust clung to her worn apron, but beneath it, her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might shatter them. The messenger's eyes found hers across the crowd, and something in his expression made her stomach twist. Not pity, but something darker, something that knew. The castle never summoned peasants. Never. Unless it was for judgment. Unless it was for death. The walk to the castle felt like drowning on dry land. Each step through the mud-thick road pulled at her worn boots, but what truly weighted her down was the crushing pressure of memory. The flames that had devoured her cottage 3 years ago still lived behind her eyelids, orange and ravenous, consuming everything she'd loved. Her husband's final scream, her daughter's tiny hand slipping from hers in the chaos. The promises the soldiers had made as they rode away. "We're here to protect you." Lies. All lies. The wind cut across her face now, cold and merciless, but it couldn't numb the burning ache that lived in her chest, that hollow space where her family used to be. The village disappeared behind her. Ahead, the castle walls rose like the bones of some ancient beast, gray and unforgiving against the pale sky. They said the king wanted to honor her for saving a wounded knight she'd found bleeding in the forest 3 nights ago. But that man's name, Sir Rowan, had awakened something in her that she'd tried desperately to bury. Terror, not of death, but of recognition, of truths that should stay buried. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her thin shawl tighter, though it did nothing against the chill seeping into her bones. The castle gates groaned open, iron scraping against stone with a sound that made her teeth ache. 2 guards stood like statues, their faces hidden beneath steel helmets, and they stepped aside without a word. No greeting, no explanation, just the yawning darkness of the corridor beyond. Torches flickering shadows that danced like demons on the walls. Arlena's breath came in shallow gasps now. The air inside smelled of old stone and something else, something metallic and wrong. Blood, perhaps, or fear. The great hall opened before her like the mouth of hell itself. Marble columns stretched toward vaulted ceilings, and between them 12 knights stood in perfect formation along the walls. 12. Arlena's legs nearly gave out. She knew these men. Every face was carved into her nightmares. The one with the scar through his eyebrow. He'd laughed as he set fire to the granary. The broad-shouldered one near the throne. She'd watched him drag the miller's wife by her hair. The youngest, standing at the end, Sir Rowan, the man she'd saved, his eyes fixed on something beyond her, refusing to meet her gaze. Her throat closed. The room swam. This wasn't honor. This was something else entirely. The king rose from his throne, and silence fell so absolute that Arlena could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. He was younger than she'd imagined, his crown sitting heavy on dark hair streaked with early gray. His voice, when it came, was measured but carried the weight of absolute authority. Today, this peasant woman will face the 12 most honored men of my kingdom. She will prove, before God and this court, who speaks the truth. The words made no sense. Face them? Prove what truth? Arlena's mouth was too dry to form questions. Her hands shook so violently she had to clasp them together to hide it. But even then, the trembling wouldn't stop. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself was preparing to swallow her whole. And then she saw him, the oldest knight, Sir Aldred, the captain of the King's Guard. His eyes found hers across the vast marble expanse, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, satisfaction. And then, slowly, deliberately, he smiled. It was the smile of a wolf that had cornered its prey, the smile of a man who knew exactly what secrets she carried, and how easily they could destroy her. It was the smile of someone who'd done this before, who'd watched others break under the weight of impossible choices. Arlena's breath caught. Her vision tunneled. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back to her village, to hide in the shadows where she belonged. But her feet wouldn't move. Because somewhere beneath the terror, beneath the crushing weight of memory and grief, a tiny spark of something else ignited. Something that had survived the flames that took her family. Something that refused to die. Rage. The murmur of voices ricocheted off the marble columns like trapped birds desperate for escape. Courtiers whispered behind jeweled hands, their eyes dissecting Arlena as if she were some curious specimen dragged in from the forest. But she wasn't trembling from fear anymore. Not entirely. The tremor in her hands had transformed into something else, something that burned white-hot in her veins. Indignation. The kind that made her jaw clench so hard her teeth ached. The kind that straightened her spine despite every instinct telling her to collapse. The king descended 3 steps from his throne, his velvet robes whispering secrets against the cold stone. His face held genuine curiosity, and that somehow made everything worse. He wasn't cruel. He was simply blind. "Tell me, woman." His voice cut through the murmuring like a blade through silk. "Why would you save a man who wears the colors of those who destroyed your village? Why show mercy to those who showed you none?" The question hung in the air, heavy as an executioner's axe, every eye in that vast hall fixed on her. Arlena could feel their gazes like physical weight pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her throat burned. Behind her eyes, images flashed. Her daughter's face, her husband's final breath, the smell of burning thatch and human hair. For a heartbeat she couldn't speak, couldn't move. The silence stretched so thin it threatened to snap. Then something inside her broke open. Not weakness, but a dam that had been holding back 3 years of grief and fury and unbearable truth. She drew in a breath that rattled in her chest and met the king's eyes directly, something no peasant should ever do. "Because I believe that even a tyrant can choose justice, if he has the courage to hear the truth." The words came out stronger than she felt, each one a stone thrown at the foundations of everything this room represented. The effect was immediate and devastating. The murmuring died as if someone had snuffed out every candle in the hall. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several courtiers gasped audibly. One lady in waiting clutched her pearl necklace so hard the strand broke, beads scattering across the floor like fleeing mice. The king's face went perfectly still, unreadable as carved marble. But it was the knights who truly revealed the impact of her words. Sir Aldred's smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. His hand drifted toward his sword hilt. Not threatening, not yet, but a reminder. A promise. The younger knights shifted their weight, leather armor creaking in the silence. Only Sir Rowan remained motionless, his face pale as death, staring at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Guilt, warning, fear. Sir Aldred stepped forward, his boots striking the marble with deliberate precision. Each footfall echoed like a judge's gavel. When he spoke, his voice dripped with contempt so thick it was almost visible. "The peasant has a silver tongue, Your Majesty. But we all know what dwells behind pretty words from desperate women." He turned to face her fully, and his eyes held such calculated cruelty that Arlena's stomach lurched. Witchcraft, manipulation, lies crafted to save her worthless neck. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Witchcraft. The word that could end her life before sunset. The word that needed no proof, only suspicion. Arlena felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Around the hall, heads nodded. Whispers grew louder, more venomous. She was losing them, losing everything before it had even begun. But the king raised one hand, and silence crashed down like a hammer. His eyes never left Arlena's face, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Something was happening behind those eyes. Calculations, considerations, curiosities she couldn't begin to guess. Finally he spoke, and his words changed everything. "I propose something different. 12 trials of honor. If this woman triumphs, the truth shall be hers to claim. Each of my knights will face her, not with swords, but with virtue." The hall erupted, knights protested, courtiers gasped. Sir Aldred's face went purple with rage, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple, but the king's voice rose above them all like thunder. "Silence, I have spoken. We shall see if honor truly resides where we've always believed it does." Arlena's heart hammered so violently she could barely hear her own thoughts over its roar. Trials, 12 of them, against 12 men who wanted her dead, who carried secrets that could crumble kingdoms. It was madness. It was suicide. But what choice did she have? She'd already spoken the words that sealed her fate. There was no retreat now, only forward, into whatever hell awaited. She forced her voice to work, though it came out rougher than she intended. "I accept." The king nodded slowly, something almost like approval flickering across his features. "Then let the first trial begin here, now, in this very moment." He gestured to Sir Aldred, whose face had gone from purple to something darker, more dangerous. "Sir Aldred, captain of my guard, most trusted of all my knights, you have served the crown for 20 years with unwavering loyalty." The king's voice dropped lower, softer, but somehow more terrible. "So answer me this, with your hand upon your heart and your soul before God. Would you swear upon your mother's eternal soul that you have never, in all your years of service, taken from the innocent, that you have never used your power to harm those weaker than yourself?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a pyre. Sir Aldred's face underwent a transformation, from rage to shock to something that looked almost like panic before settling into careful blankness. His mouth opened, closed. His hand, which had been reaching toward his heart for the oath, stopped midway and fell to his side. The silence that followed was deafening. It screamed louder than any confession. He couldn't say it, wouldn't say it. The truth was written in every line of his body, in the sweat that suddenly gleamed on his forehead, in the way his eyes darted toward the other knights as if seeking rescue that would never come. The king's expression didn't change, but something died behind his eyes, some last vestige of innocence or trust. He turned his face away, jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. Around the hall, the people who had been so quick to condemn Arlena now stared at their champion in dawning horror. The murmuring started again, but different this time, shocked, revolted, questioning everything they thought they knew. Arlena stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, victory and terror warring in her chest. She'd won the first battle, but she could see in Sir Aldred's eyes that she'd just made an enemy who would rather see her dead than live with his shame exposed. A young messenger suddenly burst through the side door, his face flushed from running. He sprinted across the marble floor with such urgency that guards moved to intercept him, but he dodged them with desperate agility. He reached the king and leaned in close, whispering frantically in his ear. Arlena watched as the color drained from the king's face. His hand gripped the arm of his throne so hard his knuckles went white. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then found her across the hall with an expression she couldn't read. Horror, recognition, betrayal. Whatever the messenger had said, it had changed everything. The king's hand trembled as he dismissed the messenger with a sharp gesture, but his eyes never left Arlena. Whatever news had reached his ears hung between them now like an invisible noose, tightening with each passing second. The air in the hall felt thicker somehow, harder to breathe, as if the very stones of the castle were holding their breath. Arlena's pulse thundered in her ears, a war drum counting down to something she couldn't name but felt in her bones. Something terrible was coming. The king's voice, when it finally came, carried a forced steadiness that fooled no one. The trials will continue. He gestured toward the second knight, a man whose polished armor gleamed so bright it hurt to look at directly. Sir Garrett of Thornwell, whose family crest was known throughout the kingdom. 3 silver swords crossed over a crimson shield, pride incarnate. Sir Garrett, you have distinguished yourself in battle countless times. Your honor is beyond question. The king paused, and in that pause, Arlena heard the trap being set. Show this woman your family crest. Let her see the symbol of nobility she could never hope to understand. Sir Garrett stepped forward with the confidence of a man who'd never known defeat, never questioned his place in the world. He removed his gauntlet with deliberate slowness, revealing the signet ring on his finger, the Thornwell crest rendered in gold and rubies. He held it up to the light streaming through the stained glass windows, and it blazed like a small sun. "Behold the mark of true nobility," he announced, his voice rolling through the hall with practiced theatrical flair, a legacy of honor stretching back 7 generations. Arlena stared at the ring, and something inside her chest cracked open. She knew that symbol. God help her, she knew it. The memory hit her with physical force. The night her village burned, the soldiers who'd moved through the smoke like demons, and on their captain's banner, those same 3 silver swords crossed over crimson. She'd watched from where she'd hidden her daughter in the root cellar, had seen those swords gleaming in the firelight as they moved from house to house, systematic as butchers at their work. Her voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside her ribcage. "I recognize your crest, Sir Garrett." The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, ripples of confusion spreading outward. "It was carved into the swords that burned my village. It was stamped on the shields of the men who dragged my neighbors from their homes. It was the last thing my husband saw before." Her voice caught, but she forced it forward. "Before he died trying to protect what was ours." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Courtiers turned to each other in shock. Sir Garrett's face went from proud to purple in the span of a heartbeat. "Lies," he roared. But there was something brittle in his voice, something that cracked around the edges. Pure fabrication from a desperate... "The village of Millbrook," Arlena continued, her voice growing stronger even as her hands shook. 3 years ago, spring, your men came at dawn when the mist was still thick. They said they were collecting taxes for the king's war. But there were no taxes collected that day, only blood, only ash. The king leaned forward on his throne, his face carved from ice. "Sir Garrett, is this true?" The knight's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold of the hall. Around him, the other knights shifted uncomfortably, their armor suddenly seeming less like protection and more like chains. "Your Majesty, in times of war, difficult decisions must be. There may have been some unfortunate. The fog of conflict can..." "Answer the question." The king's voice cut through the stammering like a blade through bone. Silence. Damning, absolute silence. Sir Garrett's hand drifted to his sword, then away, then back again, as if his body couldn't decide between fight or flight. The crest on his ring caught the light again, but now it looked less like honor and more like evidence. A murder weapon worn as jewelry. The crowd's murmuring grew from whispers to a low roar. Arlena could hear fragments. Did you hear? Millbrook, they're saying Millbrook. My cousin lived there. We thought it was bandits. The official story was crumbling, and with it, something far more fundamental. Trust, the bedrock belief that the nobility protected the weak rather than preyed upon them. The king's knuckles were white where they gripped his throne. His jaw worked silently, grinding teeth, grinding through implications that were rewriting his understanding of his own kingdom. Finally, he waved Sir Garrett away with a gesture of such contempt that the knight actually flinched. Step back. Your silence condemns you more thoroughly than any words could. But Arlena wasn't finished. The dam had broken, and now the truth poured out of her like blood from a reopened wound. The third trial, she said, her voice ringing clear and cold through the hall. Let it be in the stables. Let us see who truly provides for the kingdom's people. The king's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. They moved as a procession, king, knights, courtiers, and one peasant woman, through corridors that suddenly felt like they were closing in. The whispers followed them like ghosts. Arlena could feel eyes on her back, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. She was no longer just a curiosity. She was becoming something dangerous, something that could topple carefully constructed lies. The stables smelled of hay and horse sweat and leather, honest smells that seemed obscene after the perfumed corruption of the throne room. Sir Edmund stood waiting, the knight responsible for managing supplies and provisions for the castle and the surrounding lands. He was a broad man with soft hands that had never known real labor, his belly straining against his fine tunic. His smile was practiced, political, absolutely empty of anything resembling genuine warmth. Your Majesty, he bowed low. How may I serve? The king's voice was tired now, worn thin by revelations. Sir Edmund, this woman accuses you of diverting food meant for the common people. What say you? Sir Edmund's laugh was hearty, performative, the sound of a man used to being believed without question. Absurd. Every grain is accounted for, every measure recorded. The people are well fed under my stewardship. Arlena pointed through the stable doors to where a group of children had gathered, drawn by the unusual commotion. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp as blades beneath stretched skin. Their clothes hung on frames that spoke of long hunger, not recent hardship. Those children, she said quietly, but her words carried like a death sentence, are from the villages you claim to feed. Look at their ribs. Count their bones. They're dying slowly while your tables overflow with meat and wine and bread so fine it crumbles at a touch. Sir Edmund's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, fear, rage, calculation. They're simply, peasants are naturally thin, it's their constitution. The harvest was poor this year. The harvest was abundant. Arlena cut through his excuses like they were smoke. I worked those fields myself. I watched the grain wagons leave, counted them, wondered why our children still cried themselves to sleep from hunger while the castle storerooms bulged. Your feasts have been seasoned with their starvation. Your indulgence is purchased with their suffering. A woman in the crowd, a cook from the castle kitchens, her apron still dusted with flour, stepped forward hesitantly. Her voice shook, but determination hardened her features. She speaks true, Your Majesty. I've seen the ledgers. Numbers changed after Sir Edmund reviews them. Food listed as spoiled that was perfectly good, diverted to... She hesitated, glancing at the knight with fear in her eyes. To private sales in the next county. For profit. The king's face had gone beyond pale into something gray and terrible. He looked at Sir Edmund, then at the children, then at his own hands as if seeing blood there that wouldn't wash clean. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a kingdom's shame. This trial isn't just of one woman, is it? The question hung unanswered because everyone already knew the truth. The trial had become something else entirely, an excavation, an exhumation. Every turned stone revealing rot beneath what they'd believed was solid ground. Arlena felt a strange lightness in her chest. Not victory exactly, but vindication. Justice, perhaps, or the ghost of it. But she knew better than to feel relief. Every truth exposed made her more dangerous to powerful men. Every lie revealed tightened the noose around her own neck. Among the 12 knights, only one remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Sir Rowan, the youngest, the one she'd saved. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the stables, beyond the castle, perhaps beyond this moment entirely. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He turned slowly to face her, and something in his eyes made her blood run cold. He knew something that would change everything. The hall descended into a silence so profound that Arlena could hear the torch flames crackling in their iron sconces, could hear the rustle of fabric as people shifted their weight, afraid to breathe too loudly. Sir Rowan stood motionless among his fellow knights, but something had changed in his posture. His shoulders had squared, his spine had straightened, and his hand had moved to rest over his heart in a gesture that looked almost like an apology or a prayer. Then he stepped forward, and the sound of his boots against marble echoed like a judge's sentence. Each step measured, each step inevitable. Arlena's chest tightened, her breath coming shallow and quick. This was the man she'd saved. The man who'd been bleeding into the forest floor 3 nights ago, who'd looked at her with such desperate gratitude as she'd pressed moss and herbs to his wounds. The man who'd whispered thank you through cracked lips before losing consciousness. And now he was walking toward her with the expression of someone about to drive a knife between her ribs. He stopped 3 paces from the king's throne and knelt, the movement precise and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried through the hall with a clarity that felt rehearsed, as if he'd been practicing these words in the dark hours before dawn. "Your Majesty, I must speak." He paused, and in that pause, Arlena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This woman is not who she claims to be. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her vision swam. Her knees threatened to buckle. Around her, the crowd erupted into fresh murmuring, hungry for this new revelation, ravenous for more scandal to devour. Arlena wanted to scream, to deny, to run, but her body had frozen solid, every muscle locked in place by betrayal so complete it felt like suffocation. The king leaned forward, his eyes sharp with something between curiosity and rage. "Explain yourself, Sir Rowan, and choose your words carefully." Rowan's jaw clenched. For a moment, just a heartbeat, his eyes flicked to Arlena, and she saw something there that looked almost like regret. But then it was gone, replaced by duty's cold mask. "When she saved me in the forest, I was delirious from blood loss and fever. My mind wandered, but I heard her speaking as she worked on my wounds." He drew a shaky breath, and Arlena realized with horror that he was trembling, not from fear, but from some terrible internal struggle. She spoke to someone who wasn't there, called out a name, over and over, as if in prayer or grief. The hall held its collective breath. Arlena's heart hammered so violently against her ribs she thought they might crack. She knew what was coming. God help her, she knew. "The name," Rowan continued, his voice dropping lower, forcing everyone to strain forward to hear, "was Garrett the Ironwright." He let the name hang in the air for a moment before delivering the killing blow. "The blacksmith who was executed 15 years ago for treason against the crown. The man who supposedly conspired to assassinate your Majesty during the coronation." The reaction was instantaneous chaos. Gasps, shouts. The king shot to his feet so quickly his crown nearly fell from his head. His face had gone from gray to crimson, rage and shock warring across his features. "That man was a traitor, an enemy of the realm. His name is forbidden to be spoken in my presence." His hand slammed down on the arm of his throne with such force the sound cracked through the hall like thunder. "And you," he turned his fury on Arlena, "you dare invoke his memory? You dare bring his poison into my court?" Arlena felt the floor dropping away beneath her. This was it, the moment that would end her. She could deny it, could claim Rowan was lying or mistaken. But what good were more lies in a hall already drowning in them? Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together, pressing them against her stomach where no one could see. When she spoke, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the shocked silence like a confession spoken in an empty church. "That man was my father." The words fell like an executioner's axe. For a moment, One perfect, crystalline moment. Absolutely nothing moved. No one breathed. The world itself seemed to pause in its turning. Then the hall exploded. Courtiers shouted accusations. Knights reached for their swords. Ladies clutched their pearls and crosses, making signs against evil. The noise was deafening, a tidal wave of outrage and horror that threatened to crush her beneath its weight. But through it all, Arlena stood perfectly still, her chin raised, her eyes locked on the king. If she was going to die, she would die standing. She would die with the truth on her lips instead of cowering behind more lies. "Seize her!" someone shouted. "She's come for revenge," another voice cried. "The daughter of a traitor is a traitor herself." The calls came from everywhere at once, a chorus demanding her blood. But the king raised his hand, and somehow, impossibly, silence crashed down again. His face was a mask of barely controlled fury, veins standing out in his neck, his breathing harsh and ragged. "You dare come into my court," he said, each word precise and cold as ice, "bearing the blood of the man who tried to murder me. You save one of my knights, win the trust of my people, expose the failures of my court, all while carrying that cursed bloodline." His voice rose to a roar. "This is revenge. Elaborate, patient, cunning revenge disguised as justice." Arlena felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she had any right to expect. "My father died innocent." The words came from some deep well of certainty inside her, some place that had survived 3 years of grief and loss and unbearable weight. "I was 7 years old when they dragged him from our forge. I watched them put the noose around his neck. I listened to his final words." Her voice cracked, but she forced it forward. He said, "Tell my daughter that the truth matters more than breath, more than blood, more than life itself." The hall had gone quiet again, but this time it was different. People were listening, actually listening. Arlena took a shaking breath and continued, each word pulled from the deepest part of her soul. "I didn't come here for revenge, Your Majesty. I came because I believe, God help me, I still believe, that even in a kingdom built on lies, even in a court where the powerful prey on the weak, there might still be one person brave enough to choose truth over comfort, to choose justice over pride." She stepped forward, and guards moved to block her, but the king waved them back. She walked until she stood directly before the throne, close enough to see the conflict raging in his eyes, fury and doubt and something that might have been fear. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she was willing to risk. "My father died without honor, without justice, without anyone speaking for him." Tears finally escaped, tracking down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "I don't want your throne. I don't want your crown. I just want to prove that truth is worth more than blood, that one innocent man's memory deserves to be cleared, even if it costs me everything." The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't shock or anticipation. It was consideration, contemplation, the kind of quiet that comes when people are genuinely thinking instead of just reacting. Sir Rowan still knelt on the marble floor, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking slightly. Whether from relief at having spoken his truth or shame at the pain it had caused, Arlena couldn't tell. But she found she didn't hate him for it. The truth was always going to come out. Better to face it now than let it fester like an infected wound. The king sank back into his throne, suddenly looking much older than his years. He stared at Arlena for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the armrest in a rhythm that might have been nervous or might have been thoughtful. Finally, he spoke, and his voice had lost some of its rage, replaced by something harder to define. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. "Your father's trial was 15 years ago. The evidence was presented. The judgment was passed. The execution was carried out according to law." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I am beginning to wonder how many other lawful judgments in my kingdom rest on foundations as rotten as those I've witnessed today." He stood slowly descending the steps until he was level with her, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his beard, the weight of the crown literally pressing grooves into his forehead. When he spoke again, his voice was low, meant only for her, but in the silence of the hall, everyone heard. If you truly seek only truth and not revenge, then prove it. Tomorrow at dawn, you will stand at your father's grave. You will speak your truth before God and witnesses. And we will see. His voice caught just slightly. We will see if there is any justice left in this kingdom at all. Dawn broke cold and merciless over the royal cemetery, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and sickly gray. Frost clung to the gravestones like skeletal fingers, and the air carried that particular stillness that comes just before something irreversible happens. Arlena had not slept. How could she? The night had stretched endlessly in the castle's holding cell, each hour marked by the distant tolling of bells and the grinding weight of what awaited her. Her father's grave, a place she'd been forbidden to visit for 15 years, forbidden even to acknowledge existed. The crowd that gathered was larger than anyone had expected. Word had spread through the kingdom like wildfire during the night. The daughter of the traitor, the peasant woman who'd exposed the knights, the unlikely champion standing against the throne itself. They came from villages and farms, from taverns and workshops, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. Hope, perhaps, or the desperate need to witness whether truth could actually matter in a world that had taught them it didn't. Arlena walked between two guards, her wrists unbound but their presence a clear reminder that she was prisoner, not guest. Her legs trembled with each step, exhaustion and terror warring in her blood. The path wound through rows of ornate tombs belonging to nobles and knights, their names carved in marble, their legacies proclaimed in gold leaf. But they led her past all of these, further and further back, to where the cemetery ended and the forgotten began. The servants' section was marked by simple wooden crosses and unmarked stones, graves of those deemed unworthy of remembrance. And beyond even these, separated by a crumbling wall, lay the traitor's ground. Unconsecrated earth where those who died in disgrace were buried without ceremony, without prayers, without even the dignity of a name. Arlena's breath caught in her chest when she saw it, a plot of weeds and thistles, ground so cursed that nothing good would grow there. And in the center, a single stone, worn smooth by weather and time, bearing no inscription at all. Her knees buckled. The guards caught her elbows, holding her upright, but she could feel her strength draining away like water through cupped hands. That blank stone was her father. 15 years of rot and silence and erasure. 15 years of pretending he'd never existed, never loved her, never taught her that iron could be shaped, but truth could not be broken. The king arrived with his 12 knights, their armor dulled by the pre-dawn darkness, their faces grim. The crowd parted silently, peasants and nobles alike creating a corridor of witnesses. When the king spoke, his voice carried across the cemetery with unexpected gentleness, as if even he felt the sanctity of this cursed ground. "Speak then. Tell us your truth." Arlena's throat was so tight she could barely force air through it, let alone words. She knelt before the nameless stone, her hands pressing against earth so cold it burned. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw, scraped hollow by grief held too long. "If you believe in God, Your Majesty, then you know that truth doesn't fear time. It waits, it endures. It outlasts every lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night." Her fingers traced the blank stone, feeling every pit and groove worn by years of rain and wind. My father was Garrett the Ironwright. He made horseshoes and plowshares and gates that would last 100 years. He had hands like tree roots, scarred and strong and gentle. He taught me that good work speaks for itself, that a thing made with care carries the soul of its maker. The tears came now, unstoppable, tracking through the dirt on her face. The day they arrested him, he was making a cradle for the baker's new baby. He never got to finish it. The crowd was absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was listening. Arlena's voice grew stronger, fed by 15 years of suppressed anguish. They said he plotted to kill the king during the coronation. They said they found weapons hidden in his forge, daggers marked with royal blood. But my father couldn't read or write. He couldn't plot anything more complex than which field to plow first. He was simple and honest and good, and they murdered him for it. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, shock and recognition spreading like concentric circles in disturbed water. But before anyone could speak, before the king could respond, a figure emerged from the masses. An old woman, bent nearly double with age, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and hard years. She walked with painful slowness, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, and the crowd parted for her instinctively, recognizing something in her bearing that demanded respect. She shuffled forward until she stood beside Arlena, her breath wheezing in the cold air. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong, cutting through the dawn like a blade through silk. I was there. 4 words. 4 words that changed everything. I served in the castle kitchens for 40 years. I cleaned the floors where the nobles walked. I was invisible to them, the way all servants are invisible, useful but not quite human in their eyes. The king took a step forward, his face unreadable. "Who are you?" "My name is Marta. I served your father, and I served you as a boy." Her gnarled hands fumbled at a cord around her neck, pulling out something that caught the weak morning light. A ring. Gold, heavy, covered in 15 years of tarnish and earth. This ring belonged to Garrett the Ironwright. It was his father's, and his father's before that. Simple gold, no gems, just worn smooth by generations of honest work. Her voice cracked. The night before his execution, I watched the king's counselor, Lord Wystan, take this ring from Garrett's cell. I watched him laugh about it with the guards. Said it would fetch a good price at market, that dead traders had no need of gold. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. The king's face drained of all color. Around him, his knights shifted uncomfortably, armor creaking in the stillness. Lord Wystan, the king's chief counselor, the man who sat at the right hand of power, who advised on matters of state and justice and law. The old woman held up the ring, and in the growing dawn light, Arlena could see it clearly now. Could see the simple band her father had worn every day of his life, that he'd spun around his finger when he was thinking, that had clicked against his hammer when he worked. The ring she'd watched the guards strip from his dead hand. "I kept it," Marta continued, her voice shaking now with emotion held back for 15 years. "I dug it from the garden where Wystan buried it after he couldn't sell it. Too distinctive, too recognizable. I kept it because I knew. I knew someday the truth would need proof, and the powerful only believe what they can hold in their hands." The king's hand shot out, and Marta placed the ring in his palm. He stared at it, turning it over, and Arlena watched understanding and horror dawn across his features. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "This is evidence of theft, of corruption, of—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say what they all now understood. If the counselor had stolen from a condemned traitor, what else had he lied about? What evidence had he manufactured? What innocent man had he destroyed? But before anyone could process this revelation, before the implications could fully sink in, the crowd stirred. A commotion at the back, shouting. And then Lord Wystan himself appeared, flanked by castle guards, his face contorted with rage and something that looked like desperate fear. He must have heard what was happening, must have realized his carefully constructed lies were crumbling. He pushed through the crowd with the violence of a drowning man fighting for air. When he reached the king, his voice came out in a strangled shriek. "Your Majesty, that woman lies. That ring proves nothing. The blacksmith was a traitor, and his execution was just." His eyes were wild, darting from the king to the ring to Arlena with barely contained panic. "I served your father faithfully. I serve you faithfully. You cannot believe the word of servants and peasants over mine." The king stood frozen, the ring heavy in his palm, staring at the man who'd advised him for years, who'd helped him make decisions of life and death, who'd sat in judgment over accused criminals and condemned them with words the king had trusted absolutely. His hand began to shake. The ring trembled, catching the light, throwing golden reflections across the faces of the crowd. Then Wystan made his fatal mistake. His composure shattered completely, and desperation drove him past reason. His voice rose to a scream that echoed across the cemetery, across the cursed ground, across 15 years of buried truth. "It was your order that condemned him, not mine. Your father suspected the blacksmith. I only carried out the will of the crown." The words hung in the air like a curse. The king staggered back as if physically struck. Around them, the crowd gasped, the sound of 100 people drawing breath in unified horror. Because now the truth was fully exposed, not just corruption, not just theft, but the possibility that an innocent man had died on a king's order, that the crown itself might be built on murdered innocence. The king's face went through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat: shock, betrayal, grief, rage, and finally something that looked like the death of faith itself. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow, scraped raw. "Guards, arrest Lord Peasant." Peasant fought as they seized him, screaming accusations and threats, his carefully maintained dignity dissolving into animal panic. But Arlena barely saw it. She was staring at the king, watching him crumble under the weight of what he'd just learned, watching the certainty drain from his eyes and leave behind only the terrible question: what other injustices had been committed in his name? The great hall felt like a tomb when they returned. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows painted everything in shades of blood and gold. But there was no beauty in it, only the harsh illumination of truth that no one wanted to see. The king climbed the steps to his throne like a man walking to his own execution, each footfall heavy with the weight of revelation. His crown sat crooked on his head, and he made no move to straighten it. Around him, courtiers who'd been so quick with their judgments now stood silent, their faces pale masks of shock and dawning comprehension of their own complicity. Arlena stood in the center of the hall, exactly where she'd stood the day before when this had all begun. But everything had changed. The crowd no longer looked at her with contempt or curiosity. They looked at her with something far more dangerous: recognition. She'd become a mirror, reflecting back all the injustices they'd ignored, all the lies they'd chosen to believe because believing was easier than questioning. And mirrors, she knew, were often the first things people wanted to break. The king reached his throne but didn't sit. He stood before it, gripping its arms with white-knuckled hands, staring down at Arlena with eyes that held oceans of pain. When he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. "I have learned today that my crown may rest upon innocent blood, that my father's justice, the justice I inherited, the justice I've upheld, may have been built on the corpse of a good man." His breath came ragged, harsh. "Tell me, woman who has stripped away every comfortable lie, how does a king bear that knowledge? How does he wear a crown knowing it might be stained with murder?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over both their heads. Arlena felt every eye in the hall turn to her, waiting for her answer, hungry for her to either condemn or absolve. But she had no absolution to give, only truth, and truth had never been comfortable. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but carried through the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "You bear it by changing, your majesty, by being better than what came before." She took a step forward, her worn dress dragging across marble made for silks and velvets. "I don't want to see you fall. I want to see you rise, truly rise, above the mistakes of the past. A crown doesn't make a king. Justice does, mercy does, the courage to admit wrong and make it right." Something in the king's face shifted. The stone mask cracked, and beneath it, Arlena saw something raw and human and desperately young. He was barely older than she was, she realized. A man given power before he'd learned wisdom, expected to rule before he'd learned to question. He descended the steps slowly, deliberately, each one a choice, until he stood on the same level as Arlena. No throne between them, no elevation. Just two people standing on cold marble, both bearing wounds that would never fully heal. Then, impossibly, the king of the realm knelt before a peasant woman. The crowd gasped, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Courtiers moved forward, hands outstretched to stop this sacrilege. But the king waved them back with a gesture that brooked no argument. On his knees, he looked up at Arlena, and tears tracked down his face, cutting through the royal composure like rivers through stone. "If what you seek is justice," his voice broke completely, "then justice will be done. Your father's name will be cleared. His grave will be marked. His honor will be restored. He paused, drawing a shaking breath. But if what you seek is to punish me for the sins of those who came before, if you want this throne that has caused so much pain, his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, then it is yours. Take it. Rule this broken kingdom. God knows you've earned it more than I have. The offer crashed through the hall like thunder. For a moment, absolute silence. The kind that comes when the world holds its breath, waiting to see if it will end or continue. Arlena stared down at the kneeling king, at the crown sitting crooked on his bowed head, at the power being offered to her like a poisoned gift. The throne. Everything she'd never dared to want, never allowed herself to even imagine. The ability to reshape the kingdom, to ensure no other innocent man died unnamed and unmourned, to give peasants the same value as nobles. She could taste it, the possibility of true change, real power to make things right. Her hands trembled with the wanting of it, with the seductive whisper that maybe, just maybe, she could be the ruler this kingdom needed. That her father's death wouldn't be meaningless if it led to this moment, this transformation. But then she looked at the king's face, really looked, and saw not a tyrant, but a young man drowning in mistakes he didn't make but inherited anyway. Saw someone who could learn, could grow, could become what the kingdom needed if given the chance. And she understood with crystalline clarity that taking the throne wouldn't heal anything. It would just be revenge dressed in righteousness, another wound in a kingdom bleeding from too many already. Arlena took a step back, and the king's eyes widened in confusion. When she spoke, her voice was steady, filled with a certainty that surprised even her. "Majesty, I will accept the throne." The crowd inhaled sharply, leaning forward, "but only if you'll grant me one request, one change to the laws of this realm." The king's face transformed from despair to desperate hope. He rose to his feet slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand in a gesture so unguarded it made him look like the boy he'd probably once been. "Name it. Anything. Whatever you ask, it shall be law." Arlena drew in a breath that seemed to pull air from the very bottom of her soul. This was the moment everything had been leading to. Not revenge, not power, but this single chance to shift the foundation of everything. Her voice rang clear and strong through the hall, each word falling like a hammer shaping new reality. "I want a law that says no man or woman in this kingdom will ever again be judged by their birth, but only by their actions, that a peasant's word will carry the same weight as a knight's. That noble blood doesn't make a person noble. Only noble deeds can do that. That justice applies equally to everyone, from the poorest beggar to the highest lord." The words landed like earthquakes. Around the hall, nobles paled, knights bristled, counselors looked horrified, because what Arlena was asking for wasn't just a law, it was a revolution wrapped in legislation, the complete dismantling of the hierarchy that kept some people human and others less than, the end of a world where birth determined worth. But the common people, servants and peasants who'd been allowed into the hall by the unprecedented chaos of recent days, they wept openly. Some fell to their knees. Others clutched each other, unable to believe what they were hearing. One old man in the back simply collapsed, overcome by the weight of hope he'd thought long dead. The king stared at Arlena for a long moment, his face cycling through shock, understanding, and finally something that looked like awe. His voice, when it came, was thick with emotion. "Never in all the kingdoms of the world has there been courage greater than yours." He turned to face his court, his counselors, his knights, all the people who'd benefit from keeping things exactly as they were. "This law will be written, this law will be enforced, and any who stand against it stand against the crown itself." He gestured to his scribes, who scrambled forward with parchment and quills, hands shaking as they prepared to write words that would change everything. The king's voice rose, clear and strong, finding authority not in power, but in purpose. "Let it be known throughout the realm that on this day, justice became truly blind. That worth is measured in character, not bloodline. That the voice of the lowest among us matters as much as the highest." The hall erupted. Some applauded, common folk and a handful of nobles who'd grown tired of the corruption. Others shouted in outrage, unable to accept a world where their privilege didn't shield them from consequences. But beneath it all, something fundamental had shifted. A crack had formed in the foundation of the old order, and through that crack, light was beginning to shine. Arlena felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were something else, release perhaps, or the beginning of healing. She'd come to this castle expecting death, and found instead the possibility of redemption, not just for her father's memory, but for everyone who'd ever been deemed worthless by accident of birth. The castle bells began to toll, deep, resonant notes that carried across the city, announcing that something momentous had occurred. People would stop in the streets to listen, wondering what those bells signified. They couldn't know yet that they were hearing the sound of change itself, ringing out across a kingdom that would never be quite the same again. But even as the bells rang and the scribes wrote and the crowd celebrated or raged, a voice cut through the chaos, cold, calculating, coming from the shadows near the back of the hall where someone had been watching and waiting. And what if the truth about her still hasn't been told? The celebration died as if someone had snuffed out every candle in the hall at once. The voice belonged to Sir Rowan, and he emerged from the shadows near the pillared arcade where he'd been standing apart from the other knights. His face was pale, drawn tight with an emotion Arlena couldn't name. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but something that lived in the space between courage and cowardice. Every eye turned to him, and in the sudden silence, his footsteps echoed like a countdown to something irrevocable. The king's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, his body tensing with the muscle memory of betrayal. "Sir Rowan, you've already spoken your piece. What more could possibly?" "Everything, Your Majesty." Rowan's voice cracked on the words. He walked forward with the deliberate steps of a man approaching his own execution, each footfall measured and final. When he reached the center of the hall, he didn't kneel. Instead, he stood perfectly straight, a soldier preparing to receive judgment. "I spoke truth earlier, but not the whole truth. And this woman," he gestured to Arlena, his hand trembling, "she deserves all of it, even if it destroys me to give it." Arlena's heart began to hammer against her ribs. What more could there be? What secret had she missed? What piece of her father's story still lay buried beneath 15 years of lies? Her throat went dry and she found she couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only stand frozen as Rowan prepared to shatter whatever fragile piece they'd just built. Rowan's voice grew stronger, fed by some deep well of need to confess. "When I said Arlena saved me in the forest, I told you she whispered her father's name. That much was true. But what I didn't tell you..." He paused, swallowing hard. "What I couldn't bring myself to admit was that she also said something else while she worked on my wounds. Something I pretended not to hear because hearing it would mean facing what I'd done." The king took a step forward, his face a mask of confused intensity. "Speak plainly, knight." "What did she say?" "She said, 'Your father saved a king once and no one remembered. But I will. God help me, I will make them remember.'" Rowan's eyes found Arlena's across the hall, and in them she saw the weight of knowledge that had been eating him alive. At first I thought she was delirious, speaking nonsense. But then I couldn't stop thinking about those words. So I went to the castle archives. I dug through records that hadn't been touched in decades, through documents covered in dust and mouse droppings and the decay of forgotten history. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a scroll, yellowed with age, the edges crumbling. His hands shook as he held it up. "This is a report from the Royal Guard, dated 23 years ago, the year of the old king's coronation. Your father's coronation, Your Majesty. The day someone tried to kill him." The hall erupted in whispers. The king's face went ashen. Arlena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet because she knew this story, had known it her whole life, but no one had ever believed it. No one had ever looked. Rowan continued, his voice gaining momentum like a boulder rolling downhill, unstoppable now. "The official story says the assassination attempt was thwarted by the royal guards, that they caught the assassin before he could strike. But this report..." He unrolled the scroll with trembling fingers. "This report tells a different story. It says the assassin had already reached the king, had his dagger at the royal throat, and it was a blacksmith, working on last-minute repairs to the coronation throne, who saw what was happening and threw his hammer. Arlena's legs gave out. She would have fallen if hands hadn't caught her. Common folk who'd pushed forward, who were holding her up now because she couldn't hold herself. Tears blurred her vision, but through them she saw the king's face transforming as understanding crashed over him like a wave. The hammer struck the assassin in the head. Rowan's voice was barely above a whisper now, but in the absolute silence it carried to every corner of the hall. Killed him instantly, saved the king's life, and the blacksmith's name was Garrett. The king finished the sentence, his voice hollow with horror and grief. Garrett the Ironwright. The man my father. He couldn't complete the thought. His hands came up to cover his face, and his shoulders shook with the weight of it. We executed the man who saved the king's life? Rowan nodded, tears streaming down his own face now. The counselors wanted to keep it quiet, said it would be embarrassing for the crown if people knew a common blacksmith had done what the elite guards couldn't. So they rewarded Garrett privately, gave him gold and thanks, and buried the truth in documents no one would ever read. His voice grew bitter. But then, years later, when they needed a convenient scapegoat for something else, when someone needed to take the fall for corruption in the weapon supply, they remembered the blacksmith who knew too much about the royal guard's failures. They framed him for treason. And because he'd been sworn to secrecy about what really happened that day, because he'd promised never to speak of it, he died silent. He died protecting the very crown that murdered him. The words fell like hammer blows, each one shattering something fundamental. Arlena couldn't breathe through the sobs that were ripping out of her chest. Her father hadn't just died innocent. He'd died heroic, killed by the very people whose lives he'd saved, silenced by his own honor. The cruelty of it was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like the universe itself had torn open to reveal the darkness underneath. The king stumbled down from his throne platform, collapsing onto the marble floor as if his legs could no longer support the weight of his crown. He crawled, across the cold stone until he reached Arlena, and when he looked up at her, his face was destroyed by grief. Your father saved my father's life, and we repaid him with death and disgrace and 15 years of unmarked grave. His voice broke completely. How does anyone make that right? Arlena looked down at this king on his knees, this young man drowning in the sins of his inheritance, and felt something crack open in her chest that had been locked tight for 15 years. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness felt too small for this, too simple, but something bigger. Understanding perhaps that evil wasn't always monsters. Sometimes it was just people making terrible choices and then making more terrible choices to cover up the first ones, until they'd built a tower of lies so high they couldn't see the ground anymore. She knelt beside him, her worn dress pooling on marble beside his velvet robes, and when she spoke, her voice was raw but steady. You can't make it right. Some things can't be fixed, only learned from. She reached out and did something unthinkable, touched the king's face, forcing him to look at her. But you can honor his memory. You can make sure his sacrifice meant something. You can build a kingdom where truth doesn't get people killed and honor doesn't lead to unmarked graves. The king's hands came up to grip hers, holding on like a drowning man to driftwood. The law you asked for, it's not enough. Tell me what else. Tell me how to make his name live. Arlena drew a shaking breath, and when she spoke, she gave voice to the dream that had kept her alive through 3 years of grief and poverty and endless night. I want his name carved in the castle walls. I want every child in this kingdom to learn the story of Garrett the Ironwright, who saved a king and died for his silence. I want noble to mean what he was, loyal, honest, brave, not what you're born into. Her voice grew stronger. And I want every person accused of a crime to have someone who will dig through old documents and look for the truth, the way Sir Rowan did. I want justice to mean searching for what's real, not what's convenient. The king nodded, still gripping her hands, and around them the hall had gone quiet again. But this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of witnessing something sacred. A king and a peasant, both broken by the same terrible truth, trying to build something better from the pieces. Sir Rowan approached slowly, dropping to his knees beside them both. I should have spoken sooner. I knew for 2 days before the trial began. I kept silent because I was afraid. Afraid of what the other knights would think. Afraid of upending everything I'd been taught to believe. His voice was thick with self-loathing. I'm no better than those who killed him. But Arlena reached out, placing her other hand on Rowan's shoulder. You spoke when it mattered most. That's what makes the difference. She looked between the two men, seeing in both of them the struggle between what they'd been taught and what they were learning to become. My father used to say that iron is strongest when it's been through the fire. Maybe people are the same. The king rose slowly, helping Arlena to her feet, and then extended his hand to Rowan. When all three stood together, monarch, knight, and peasant, something fundamental had shifted in the kingdom's foundation. The king's voice, when he addressed the hall, carried a new quality, not the authority of power, but the authority of purpose. Today, we don't just change a law. We change what this kingdom means. The days that followed moved with the strange quality of a dream that refuses to end, each moment suspended between what was and what might be. The king ordered scribes to work through the nights, copying Rowan's discovery onto fresh parchment, creating records that could never be buried again. Arlena watched from the castle windows as workers began carving her father's name into the great stone wall facing the main courtyard. Letters 3 feet tall that would endure for centuries, telling a story that had almost been erased forever. But it was the small moments that truly broke her. The way common folk began gathering at her father's grave, leaving flowers and bits of ribbon and small tokens of gratitude. The way mothers pointed to the carving on the wall and told their children, "See? That's what real honor looks like." The way the king himself had walked to the cemetery alone one dawn and spent an hour kneeling in the frost, speaking words to a dead man that no one else would ever hear. On the 7th day after the revelation, the kingdom gathered for a ceremony unlike any in its history. Not a coronation or a royal wedding, but something simpler and somehow more profound, the dedication of truth. The castle courtyard was packed with people, nobles and peasants standing shoulder to shoulder, the old hierarchies beginning to dissolve like morning mist under sunlight. The king stood on a raised platform, but Arlena stood beside him, not below, not behind, but equal. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that the castle seamstresses had made for her, refusing her protests, insisting that she deserved at least this much. Her hair had been washed and braided with care she hadn't known in years, but beneath the fine clothes and kind treatment, she was still the same woman who'd scrubbed tavern floors for bread. Still the daughter of a murdered blacksmith. Still someone who understood that fancy dressing couldn't erase hard truths. The king raised his hand, and silence fell across the gathered crowd like snow. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard with a clarity that seemed to reach into every heart present. Today, we honor a man who died 15 years ago, unmourned and unnamed. Garrett the Ironwright, who saved a king and was rewarded with execution, who kept silent to protect those who would destroy him. Who taught his daughter that truth matters more than breath, more than blood, more than life itself. He turned to face the great carving on the wall, and his voice grew thick with emotion. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot give him back the years stolen, the life cut short, the honor that should have been his. But I can ensure that his sacrifice was not meaningless, that his death changes the kingdom he died trying to protect. The king gestured, and servants brought forward a wooden chest bound in iron. When they opened it, sunlight glinted off gold, coins and cups and jewelry, a fortune that made the crowd gasp. This is blood money, the king said quietly, the wealth that Lord Wyston and his conspirators stole from the innocent over the years. It will be distributed to the families they destroyed, the villages they plundered, the people they deemed worthless because they weren't born to privilege. Another gesture, and more servants appeared, carrying scrolls sealed with royal wax. These are pardons for every person convicted on testimony from corrupt officials. Every case will be reviewed, every judgment questioned, every supposed truth examined under light instead of hidden in darkness. And anyone, his voice grew stronger, anyone who has been wronged by those in power will have the right to demand investigation, regardless of their birth or station. The crowd erupted in sound, cheers and tears and disbelieving laughter from people who'd never imagined justice would include them. But Arlena remained quiet, watching the king with eyes that saw more than the crown and ceremony. She saw the weight he carried, the impossible task of trying to heal wounds that went back generations, of trying to be better than everything that had made him. The king turned to her, and in his eyes she saw a question he was afraid to ask. So she answered it before he could speak. "No," she said softly, but her voice carried in the sudden hush. "I won't take the throne." The king's face cycled through relief and confusion. "But you've earned it, more than earned it. You've proven yourself wiser than any of us, braver than—" "I'm a blacksmith's daughter," Arlena interrupted gently. "I know how to recognize good iron and how to spot the flaws. I know when something is strong enough to bear weight and when it needs more time in the fire." She looked at him steadily. "You're still being forged, Your Majesty, but you're not broken. You just need to remember that crowns don't make kings, choices do. Every day, every decision, every moment you choose truth over comfort." She stepped back, and the gesture was more than physical. It was a refusal of power, a rejection of revenge dressed as righteousness. "I have what I came for. My father's name is cleared. His story will be remembered. And this kingdom is changing because of what we uncovered together. Not because I rule it, but because you're learning to rule it differently." The king's eyes glistened with tears he didn't try to hide. "Then what will you do? Where will you go? You can't just return to—" He gestured helplessly. "To nothing. Not after everything." Arlena smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd felt on her face in 3 years. "I'm going home. To my village. To rebuild the cottage that burned. To teach children that their voices matter, that their worth isn't determined by their birth." She looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching her with hope and recognition. "Someone needs to plant the seeds of what we started here. Someone needs to make sure this change reaches beyond castle walls." She moved toward the edge of the platform, preparing to descend back into the crowd, back into the anonymity of common life. But the king's voice stopped her. "Wait, please." He removed something from around his neck, a chain bearing a simple iron medallion stamped with the royal seal. Not gold, not jeweled, just honest iron shaped with care. "Take this, not as payment or reward, but as a promise. If you ever need anything, if anyone tries to silence you or harm you or make you disappear again, you show them this. You remind them that the crown itself vouches for your worth." Arlena took the medallion, feeling the weight of iron that had been heated and hammered and shaped with purpose. It felt right in her hand, familiar, like touching a piece of her father's legacy. She slipped it around her neck, tucking it beneath her dress where it rested against her heart. The crowd parted as she descended from the platform, but they didn't stay back. They reached out to touch her hands, her dress, murmuring blessings and thank yous and promises to remember. She walked through them slowly, taking time to meet eyes and squeeze hands, to give back some of the connection they were offering. These were her people, not subjects or followers, but equals bound together by the understanding that they'd all survived injustice and were building something better from its ruins. At the courtyard gate, she paused and looked back one final time. The king stood alone on the platform now, his crown catching the sunlight, his hand raised in farewell. But he wasn't looking at her with the eyes of a monarch watching a subject leave. He was looking at her the way one survivor looks at another, with recognition and respect, and the knowledge that they'd both been changed by their collision with truth. Sir Rowan appeared beside her, no longer in his knight's armor but in simple traveling clothes. "I'm coming with you," he said quietly. "If you'll have me. I need to do something that matters, something real." Arlena studied his face, seeing the earnestness there, the desperate need to atone. She nodded once. "The village needs rebuilding. Lots of work ahead." "Good," he said, and something in his expression eased. "I'm better at building than I ever was at destroying." They walked through the castle gates together as the bells began to toll, not in mourning or celebration, but in acknowledgement. The sound followed them down the winding road toward the village, toward home, toward whatever came next. Behind them, the king stood on the castle ramparts, watching until they disappeared from view, his hand pressed against his chest, where his heart beat beneath velvet and jewels and the crushing weight of a crown that was just beginning to understand what it truly meant to rule. And in the village of Varnell, where Arlena had scrubbed floors and survived grief and kept her father's memory alive through sheer force of will, people prepared for her return. Not as a hero or a martyr, but as one of their own who'd gone to face impossible odds and somehow, impossibly, won. Not with swords or armies or violence, but with the most powerful weapon of all, truth spoken in the face of power that wanted silence. The king stood alone now, his fingers tracing the carved letters of Garrett the Ironwright's name on the wall. He whispered into the stone, into the memory of a man he'd never met but whose sacrifice had saved 2 kings, one from an assassin's blade and one from his own ignorance. "She defeated 12 knights," he murmured, his voice carried away by the wind, "and a king, not with weapons, but with a heart brave enough to believe that truth could actually matter." He placed his palm flat against his father's name carved beneath Garrett's, feeling the cold stone, and made a promise to both the dead and the living. This kingdom would be better. Not perfect. Perfection was impossible, but better. One choice at a time, one truth at a time, one voice that mattered at a time. And somewhere on the road between castle and village, Arlena walked with the sun warm on her face and her father's memory finally free from its unmarked grave. And for the first time in 15 years, she felt something that had been dead inside her beginning to wake. Not happiness, not yet, but its precursor. Hope. The stubborn, dangerous, beautiful hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could change. That honor could mean more than birth. That a peasant girl's truth could reshape a kingdom. That her father's death had not been meaningless after all. Arlena stood before a king and refused a crown, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood something most of us forget. True power isn't in ruling others, but in changing how they see themselves. She could have taken revenge. She could have seized the throne and made those who hurt her suffer. But instead, she chose something far more difficult. She chose to plant seeds of change that would outlive her, to transform a kingdom not through force, but through the stubborn, radical belief that truth matters more than comfort. Ask yourself this. If you had lost everything, if those in power had murdered everyone you loved and erased your father's name from history, would you have the strength to forgive? Would you choose justice over vengeance? Would you walk away from ultimate power because you knew that real change doesn't come from replacing one crown with another, but from teaching people that every voice deserves to be heard? Arlena's story reminds us that the greatest battles aren't fought with swords, but with the courage to speak truth when silence is safer. That nobility isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose every single day, in moments when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. She defeated 12 knights and a king not through violence, but through the devastating weapon of honesty spoken with love instead of hatred. Her father died believing that truth mattered more than life itself, and his daughter proved him right. She showed us that even in the darkest kingdoms, even when the powerful seem untouchable, one person's refusal to stay silent can reshape the world. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own voice and whether you're using it, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video to help others find Arlena's story. Subscribe to this channel for more tales that challenge us to be braver, kinder, and more honest than we think we can be. Because every time we choose truth over comfort, every time we speak for those who've been silenced, we become part of a story bigger than ourselves. We become the change we wish had come sooner. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, your voice matters more than you know.